For a century and a half, one name carried the weight of the Confederacy's greatest defeat. It was spoken with contempt at veterans' reunions, written into school textbooks across the South, and repeated so many times that it calcified into something that felt like historical fact. The name was James Longstreet, and the charge against him was simple, devastating, and almost entirely constructed. The story of how a general gets turned into a villain is rarely about what happened on the battlefield. It is usually about what happens after, who survives, who holds a pen, who controls the memory of a war. In the case of Gettysburg, the men who controlled that memory had personal reasons to redirect blame. They had reputations to protect, legacies to curate, and a mythology to build. They chose Longstreet as their sacrifice, and for generations, almost no one pushed back hard enough to stop it. What actually happened during those 3 days in Pennsylvania in July of 1863 is a story of cascading failures, missed opportunities, and decisions that cannot be laid at any single man's feet. But the version of events that dominated American historical memory for most of the 20th century was not the complicated truth. It was a carefully engineered prosecution conducted by men who waited until their main target could not effectively defend himself. If these forgotten stories hit home for you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep the raw history coming. James Longstreet was born in South Carolina in 1821 and raised partly in Georgia, but he was never the quintessentially Southern figure his post-war critics would have preferred. He was pragmatic where others were romantic, cautious where others were reckless, and he had a temperament shaped more by West Point professionalism than by the plantation culture that defined many of his peers. He graduated from the military academy in 1842 and served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, earning brevets for bravery at Churubusco and Molino del Rey. When the Civil War came, he resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy, not out of fiery secessionist conviction, but out of the same sense of regional loyalty that swept up thousands of officers who privately harbored doubts about the wisdom of the whole enterprise. By 1862, Robert E. Lee considered him indispensable. Lee called him his old war horse. That phrase has been quoted so often it has lost its texture. But think about what it actually conveys, not my brilliant tactician or my most aggressive fighter. A war horse, something dependable, something that holds under pressure, something you trust when everything around you is breaking. Lee used Longstreet's corps as the anchor of his army, deploying him where the situation was most desperate and the margin for error was smallest. At Second Bull Run, at Antietam, at Fredericksburg, Longstreet delivered. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of general whose exploits lent themselves easily to legend. But he was the kind who kept armies intact when lesser commanders would have gotten men killed for nothing. The friction between Longstreet and Lee existed long before Gettysburg, but it was a friction of professional disagreement, not personal animosity. Longstreet believed, with a conviction rooted in his study of the war's emerging character, that the Confederacy could not afford to keep trading men for ground. The Union had more men. It had more factories, more railroads, more of everything that modern war consumed. Longstreet thought the South's only viable path was to fight defensively, to maneuver, to find favorable ground, to make the Union bleed so badly that the Northern public would demand peace. He called it strategic offense and tactical defense. Lee, whose instincts ran toward aggressive assault, found this philosophy maddening. They were both right about certain things and both wrong about others, but they were fundamentally looking at the same war through different lenses. When the Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania in June of 1863, Longstreet carried his convictions with him. He later wrote that he believed he had secured some kind of understanding with Lee, that the campaign would be fought on defensive terms, that they would not hurl the army against entrenched positions if they could avoid it. Whether Lee ever truly agreed to this, or whether Longstreet misread the conversation, remains one of the genuinely unresolvable questions of Civil War historiography. What is clear is that when the armies collided at Gettysburg, the two men were not operating from the same script. July 1st was not supposed to be the battle. A.P. Hill's corps blundered into Union cavalry west of town, and what began as a reconnaissance in force became a full engagement before Lee had made any decision about whether to fight there at all. By afternoon, the Confederates had driven the Union 1st and 11th Corps back through the streets of Gettysburg, in a rout that looked, for a few hours, like it might decide the battle on its own. The Union soldiers fell back to Cemetery Hill and the high ground south of town. It was defensible ground. Very defensible ground. This is where the first of Gettysburg's great what-ifs lives. Richard Ewell commanded Lee's Second Corps and was in position, after the afternoon's success, to potentially push forward and take Cemetery Hill before the Union Army could consolidate. Lee sent him discretionary orders: pursue the attack, if practicable. Ewell decided it was not practicable. He halted. The hill remained in Union hands overnight. By morning, it was fortified, and the high ground that ran south from Cemetery Hill, along Cemetery Ridge, all the way to two hills called Little Round Top and Big Round Top, had become one of the strongest defensive positions in the Eastern Theater. Nothing about Longstreet's conduct on July 1st contributed to this situation. He was not on the field. He was not yet up with his corps. The position the Union Army now occupied, the position that would define the next 2 days of bloodshed, was established before Longstreet had any role to play at all. But this inconvenient sequencing of events would later be smoothed over by men who needed a cleaner narrative. On the morning of July 2nd, Lee decided to attack. Longstreet argued against it. He proposed instead that the Army move around the Union left, get between Meade's army and Washington, find good ground, and wait to be attacked. This was not cowardice. This was not obstruction. This was a reasoned operational proposal from the general who knew the ground as well as anyone, and who had spent 18 months watching frontal assaults chew up Confederate formations. Lee overruled him. The attack would go forward against the Union left flank. What followed in the afternoon of July 2nd was an attack that nearly worked. Longstreet's corps, advancing in brutal heat across open ground, smashed into the Union left at the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den. The fighting was savage. Daniel Sickles had moved his Third Corps forward into an exposed salient without orders, and Longstreet's men tore through it. They came within yards of taking Little Round Top, a hill whose loss might have unraveled the entire Union position. Joshua Chamberlain's famous bayonet charge at the end of that afternoon, down the slope of Little Round Top, stopped the Confederate advance, but only barely. The attack did not succeed in breaking the Union line. Longstreet's critics would later say this was because he moved too slowly, that he delayed the assault by hours and threw away the chance for a decisive Confederate victory. This charge became the central indictment. The claim was that Lee had ordered an attack at dawn or early morning, and that Longstreet, sulking and insubordinate, had dragged his feet until late afternoon, by which time the Union Army had reinforced its position. The problem with this version of events is the evidence. There is no contemporaneous document. No order written that day, no dispatch, no staff officer's note from July 2nd, 1863, establishing that Lee ordered an attack at any specific early hour. The Sunrise Attack Order was a piece of post-war testimony produced years after the fact by men with extensive personal and political reasons to construct it. Lee himself, in his official report written that autumn, made no mention of ordering an early attack or of any failure by Longstreet to comply with orders. He described the attack on the second day in terms that placed the delay in the practical difficulties of getting into position, not in any dereliction by his corps commander. Longstreet did delay on the morning of July 2nd. That much is not disputed. He delayed partly because the march route his men were using was found to be visible to Union signal stations and had to be changed. He delayed partly because he was waiting for one of his divisions, George Pickett's, that had not yet arrived, though he eventually proceeded without it. He delayed because he believed the attack was a mistake and, in the way that generals who believe they are about to send men to die needlessly sometimes do, he moved with less urgency than he might have. Whether an earlier attack would have produced a different result is a counterfactual that cannot be answered. The Union Army's position was strengthening throughout the day, yes, but so were the Confederate formations. The variables are too many, the ground too complex, to confidently declare that Longstreet cost the Confederacy a victory by attacking at 4 in the afternoon instead of 11 in the morning. July 3rd brought Pickett's charge. This decision was entirely Lee's. Longstreet opposed it with a vehemence that bordered on anguish. He later wrote that he told Lee he did not believe any 15,000 men alive could cross that open ground and take those heights. Lee ordered the assault anyway. Longstreet commanded it because that was his duty, and because he was a soldier, and because refusing a direct order from your commanding general in the middle of a campaign is not an option that the culture of that army made available to subordinates. When George Pickett asked him before the charge whether he should advance, Longstreet could not speak the word. He simply bowed his head. Pickett went forward. More than 6,000 Confederate soldiers became casualties in less than an hour. The charge broke apart against the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. It was the end of the battle, and, in many ways, the end of any serious Confederate chance at winning the war. Lee rode out to meet the broken formations as they staggered back. He told men it was all his fault. He said it repeatedly, to Pickett, to the soldiers, to anyone who would hear him. Whatever his private accounting of responsibilities, his public words in the immediate aftermath of Gettysburg were unambiguous. The defeat was his. And then the war ended, and Lee died in 1870, and Longstreet made two catastrophic decisions that sealed his fate. He became a Republican. He endorsed Ulysses Grant for president. In the post-war South, these were not merely political choices. They were acts of cultural apostasy. The Confederacy was being rebuilt in memory as a noble cause. Its defeat transformed from a military failure into a kind of tragic martyrdom. The men who shaped this mythology, which historians would later call the lost cause, needed their heroes unblemished and their scapegoats clearly marked. Lee had to be perfect. Jackson, dead since Chancellorsville, was already a saint. Longstreet, alive and busy aligning himself with the hated occupying government, was a traitor to everything the mythology required. The man who orchestrated the campaign against Longstreet's reputation, more than any other, was Jubal Early. Early had commanded a corps at Gettysburg and performed with something less than distinction himself. It was his troops, and Ewell's, who failed to press the attack on July 1st, who left Cemetery Hill in Union hands. Early had spent the war years alternating between competence and erratic failure. After the war, he fled to Mexico and then Canada rather than live under Reconstruction. And when he finally came back, he devoted himself with obsessive energy to shaping how the Confederacy would be remembered. He helped found the Southern Historical Society, he wrote articles, he gave speeches at veterans' reunions, and he made James Longstreet his project. Early's attacks followed a consistent logic. He argued that Lee had wanted to attack Early on July 2nd, and that Longstreet's delay had cost the Confederacy its best chance at victory. He argued that Longstreet had been slow, sulking, and insubordinate. He gathered testimony from other former Confederate officers, many of whom had reasons of their own to redirect blame away from their own failures, and published it in the Southern Historical Society papers, which was, in effect, a journal he controlled. The academic apparatus of the Lost Cause was largely his creation. William Nelson Pendleton, Lee's former chief of artillery, added another layer. In a speech in 1873, Pendleton claimed that Lee had given Longstreet explicit orders to attack at sunrise on July 2nd, and that Longstreet had disobeyed. It was a remarkable claim. It rested on no contemporaneous evidence whatsoever. Pendleton himself had not witnessed the exchange he described. When Longstreet demanded specifics and documentation, none were produced, but the charge had been made publicly at a veterans gathering before an audience primed to believe it, and its lack of documentary support did not prevent it from spreading. Longstreet fought back. He published his own memoir, From Manassas to Appomattox, in 1896, in which he defended his conduct and offered his own account of events. The book was well received in the North, where many readers were inclined to believe anything critical of the Lost Cause mythology. In the South, it was treated as further evidence of his treachery. He was not a credible witness in his own defense, because the verdict had already been rendered in the court that mattered, the court of Southern memory. The mechanism by which the Longstreet mythology became American mythology, not just Southern mythology, is worth examining. The Lost Cause version of events had its greatest popular victory in the first decades of the 20th century, when reconciliation between North and South was a political priority, and Northern publishers, educators, and opinion makers were willing to accept Southern interpretations of the war in the interest of national unity. Douglas Southall Freeman's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Lee, published in the 1930s and 1940s, treated Longstreet with barely concealed contempt, and accepted without serious examination the claim that his delays had cost the battle. Freeman's work was enormously influential, For two generations of students, historians, and general readers, his account defined how Lee and Longstreet were understood. The textbooks followed. Battlefield tour guides followed. The interpretation became infrastructure. When you visit Gettysburg today and hear the narrative of July 2nd, you are, in some ways, still hearing an echo of Jubal Early. The rehabilitation of Longstreet began in earnest in the latter half of the 20th century, driven by historians who were willing to go back to primary sources and ask uncomfortable questions. Thomas Connolly and Archer Jones, in their 1973 book, The Politics of Command, began dismantling the Lee mythology with forensic care, examining the actual documentary record of the Gettysburg campaign, and finding it far more ambiguous than the standard narrative suggested. Glenn Tucker's work on Longstreet made similar arguments. By the 1990s, historians like Jeffrey Wirt and William Piston had produced full-length re-examinations of Longstreet's career that directly confronted the post-war smear campaign and concluded it was largely without foundation. What these historians found, when they looked, was a paper trail that told a different story than the one Early and Pendleton had constructed. Lee's own after-action reports made no mention of orders violated or delays that cost the battle. Staff officers who wrote their memoirs in the years immediately after the war, before the lost cause narrative had fully calcified, did not describe a sunrise attack order or Longstreet's insubordination. The timeline of events on July 2nd, reconstructed carefully, showed that even under the most generous interpretation, Longstreet's attack was delayed by a few hours from what might have been possible. Not by half a day, not by orders given at dawn and ignored until afternoon. The sunrise attack order, the cornerstone of the indictment, existed primarily in testimony produced by men who were, at the time of their testimony, engaged in a coordinated effort to assign blame. This does not mean Longstreet made no mistakes. He did. His assault on July 2nd, though nearly successful, left gaps in coordination that a more aggressive subordinate might have pressed. His relationship with Lee at Gettysburg was compromised by his fundamental disagreement about strategy, and that disagreement may have affected the energy and initiative with which he executed orders he believed were wrong. Military historians will argue about these questions indefinitely because the evidence genuinely supports multiple interpretations, but there is a difference between Longstreet made some tactical errors that may have affected the battle's outcome, and Longstreet deliberately disobeyed orders, acted in bad faith, and bears primary responsibility for the Confederate defeat. The first is a defensible historical judgment, the second is a myth. The broader irony of the Gettysburg blame narrative is what it obscures about the battle's actual dynamics. Lee arrived at Gettysburg having just lost Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier. His army had been reorganized into 3 corps from 2, and the new corps commanders, Ewell and A.P. Hill, had never operated at that level before. Ewell, who had served brilliantly as a division commander under Jackson, seemed paralyzed on the evening of July 1st by the kind of discretionary judgment Jackson had never permitted him to exercise. Hill's corps had stumbled into the battle almost accidentally, and his management of his troops over 3 days was inconsistent at best. Stuart's cavalry, which Lee relied on for intelligence, had been on an ill-conceived raid that left the army blind for days before the battle. These failures are not minor footnotes. They shaped the battle as fundamentally as anything Longstreet did or did not do. Lee's own decision-making at Gettysburg deserves a scrutiny it rarely receives in popular accounts. He chose to fight at Gettysburg despite his pre-campaign statements that he did not want to bring on a major engagement until his army was fully concentrated. He attacked on July 2nd against the advice of his most experienced corps commander, against a position of demonstrated strength without the reconnaissance needed to understand what he was sending his men against. He ordered Pickett's charge on July 3rd after 2 days of attacks had failed to break the Union line, despite the fact that the same ground the charge would cross had been swept by artillery fire with limited effect on the Union position. These decisions are not the decisions of an infallible commander. They are the decisions of a general who believed, perhaps with too much faith in his men and too little regard for arithmetic, that aggressive attack could overcome the structural disadvantages the Confederacy faced. None of this means Lee was a bad general. He was, by almost any measure, one of the most capable army commanders the war produced. But the mythology that required him to be beyond criticism required someone else to carry the weight of Gettysburg, and Longstreet was elected to carry it because he had made himself politically expendable. The deeper damage of the Longstreet myth is what it did to understanding. When an army's defeat is attributed to one man's failure of nerve, it becomes possible to imagine that a different choice at one moment would have changed everything. This is enormously satisfying, psychologically. It preserves the sense that the men who lost were actually better soldiers, better commanders, more deserving of victory, and that only a specific correctable failure stood between them and success. It is also, almost always, historically false. Battles are lost and won through accumulations of advantage and disadvantage, through logistics and numbers and terrain and weather and 1,000 decisions large and small. Gettysburg was not lost because James Longstreet moved slowly on the afternoon of July 2nd. It was lost because the Union Army occupied better ground, fought with at least equal skill, and was led, over those 3 days, with enough intelligence and enough determination to hold what it had. George Meade, the Union commander, is himself an underappreciated figure in the Gettysburg story, a man who took command of the Army of the Potomac 3 days before the battle, inherited a strategic situation he had not shaped, and managed 3 days of desperate fighting without a catastrophic mistake. He had his own critics, men who thought he should have counterattacked more aggressively after repelling Pickett's charge, and Grant would later grow frustrated with his caution. But at Gettysburg itself, Meade did what he needed to do, and he did it under conditions that would have broken many generals. Longstreet lived until 1904. He spent his final decades as a federal marshal, a railroad commissioner, and a tireless, often clumsy defender of his own record. He gave interviews, he wrote letters, he published his memoirs. He watched men who had fought alongside him spend their declining years poisoning his name in journals and at reunions he was not always welcome to attend. His second wife, Helen Dortch Longstreet, whom he married in 1897 when he was 76 and she was 34, continued defending his reputation aggressively long after his death, publishing a book in 1904 called Lee and Longstreet at High Tide that pushed back against his critics with considerable force. She lived until 1962. There is something almost unbearable about this chronology. A man's reputation so systematically destroyed that the effort to repair it stretched across 2 generations. The physical landscape of Gettysburg itself encodes the mythology in stone and bronze. The Virginia Memorial on Seminary Ridge, dedicated in 1917, places Lee at its center, heroic and composed. The monuments to the assault on July 2nd honor the Confederate dead without interrogating the decisions that sent them forward. Longstreet's own monument on the battlefield, a bronze equestrian statue, was not dedicated until 1998, 135 years after the battle. And even then it was controversial, its placement somewhat awkwardly off the main tour route, as if even in bronze he remained unwelcome in the central narrative. The 1998 dedication came in the wake of the film Gettysburg, released in 1993, which adapted Michael Shara's novel The Killer Angels, and gave Tom Berenger's Longstreet a dignity and complexity that the Lost Cause tradition had always denied him. For millions of viewers, this was the first sympathetic portrayal of Longstreet they had encountered. The film has its own distortions and simplifications, as historical films inevitably do, but its Longstreet is recognizably the general the documents describe. A man who knew the assault was wrong, said so, and obeyed anyway, because that was the kind of soldier he was. That image took 130 years to reach a mass audience. What the Longstreet story teaches about historical memory is worth sitting with. Victors shape narratives in wars, but so do survivors in lost causes, sometimes more aggressively, because they have more at stake. The Lost Cause needed Gettysburg to be a near victory stolen by a traitor's failure. It needed Lee to have been right, and Longstreet to have been the reason Lee's rightness could not translate into success. This was not history. It was grief organized into accusation, with political purpose and personal grievance layered on top. The corrections have been coming steadily. Gary Gallagher's work on the Army of Northern Virginia has done more than perhaps anyone's to restore analytical rigor to the study of this campaign. Ethan Rayfuse's study of the Army's command structure during the Gettysburg campaign reconstructs the operational decisions of those 3 days with care for what the evidence actually shows. Alan Guelzo's Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, published in 2013, offers one of the most thorough single-volume treatments of the battle and assigns responsibility with nuance rather than convenience. The academic consensus that has emerged from this work is not that Longstreet was blameless, no general in a losing battle is, but that he was not the primary cause of the Confederate defeat, that the claims against him were largely manufactured after the fact, and that the Army's failures on those 3 days were distributed much more widely than the myth acknowledged. There remains a stubborn popular persistence to the old story. It shows up in comment sections on Civil War videos, in arguments at battlefield tours, in the occasional historian who still treats the Sunrise attack claim as credible, despite the absence of contemporaneous evidence. Myths do not die when the scholarship against them accumulates. They die when the emotional need they serve diminishes, and the emotional need the Longstreet myth served, the need to believe that the Confederacy lost through betrayal rather than through the structural impossibility of what it was attempting, has not fully vanished.